So good afternoon, everybody. Before I continue on the lecture today, just a reminder that this coming Thursday, we will have exam one. So we will not have a class here, so you don't have to come to class. And of course, no need to go to Zoom. And just to remind you, some students asked me if it's going to be an open book, and yes, it's an open book, and you will take the exam in Canvas the same way that you do the quizzes. The exam is going to be in the same style. The difference is that instead of only 2 questions that we have on the quizzes, we're going to have 40 questions. And there is also a time limit, 1 hour and 15 minutes, which is the time of our usually class time here. And you're going to see just 1 question at a time, and you cannot go back, same way as the quiz. And you should be just aware about the time limit. Of course, you can look at your notes, you can look at the course material, slides, textbook, and everything. But there is a time limit that if you don't, or if you're not careful, the exam will close on yourself after 1 hour and 15 minutes. So just this document here, so in the syllabus, just to explain there, we saw chapter 1, chapter 10 on age and sex composition, chapter 1 on introduction. We are now finishing chapter 12, world population change over time, and then chapter 13, population change in the US. And in whatever slide we stop here, that's going to be the material covered on exam 1. So that's pretty much the material covered on lectures 1 through 5. Some of you noticed that the few questions that might appear both in the quizzes and the exams, they might not be all written in my slides. So, for example, in which stage of the demographic transition are sub-Saharan African countries? That's not in the slides, but it's in the textbook. So that's why I have been telling you guys that you should read the textbook before coming to class, or at least before taking the quizzes and before taking the exam. And as you see also in the syllabus here, that same style that I just mentioned, 40 questions, 0.5 points per question, so 20 points in total. And this other document, which is also available in the course website. So you can just go to the course website and you're going to see this guide for online quizzes and exams. I mentioned here again that the exam is going to be 40 multiple choice questions, 0.5 points each, and 1 hour and 15 minutes to complete the exam. So the exam is going to be open in Canvas on Thursday from 1 p.m. to 8 p.m. But once you start it, you have 1 hour and 15 minutes to finish it. And here in the bottom, there is more information about it. You can just see 1 question at a time. You cannot go back to the previous question. And 40 questions in 1 hour and 15 minutes or in 75 minutes, it's pretty much an average of 1 minute and 52 seconds per question. So almost 2 minutes per question. So that's a lot of time. In previous semesters, I had done it 50 questions, but these were usually more in person, like people would take the exam in paper so they could look back at the question. So since here we just see 1 question at a time and you cannot go back after you answer it, I decrease the number of questions to 40 instead of 50, okay? And if you have any questions, please ask me by email. And if you have any problems during the exam, just let me know, but try to start the exam at least before 6:30, because if you start at 7, you're going to have just 1 hour to finish the exam and not 1 hour and 15 minutes. Okay, so just be careful with that. So we are now talking about the exam. The final exam, we're going to have more time, but not the exams, right? All cool? So in the previous class, I passed fast on these tables here that I generated by watching the lecture by Hans Rosling on this link here, and his video is available also in our course website. And his main point about population size for these next decades is that, yes, it will continue to increase from 7 billion to 9 billion in 2050 to 11 billion in 2100, but it's not going to be such a fast increase as we saw in previous decades. And then after 2100, this number of 11 billion people on Earth might tend to stabilize. And what this table here and what his point he makes on his presentation is that what's changing, what's more interesting for demographers, for people who want to understand all the demographic changes in the world, is the geographic distribution of the population, right? So more like in more present times, we have around 1 billion people living in the American continent, considering from North to South America, 1 billion in Europe, 1 billion in Africa, and 4 billion in Asia. By 2050, we expect an increase, or not an increase in the size of the population in the American continent and the European continent, but the population in Africa will double from 1 to 2 billion. And we will also add another billion to the population in Asia from 4 to 5. And then up to 2100, America, Europe, and Asia tend to be stable, but again, Africa will double in size from 2 to 4 billion. And if this population in Africa that's increasing in such a fast scale compared to other areas in the world, they don't have a minimum standard of life, that people don't have enough resources in terms of education, in terms of income, we're going to see a huge amount of people living in poverty in the African continent, right? So that's the main issue here. It's not just overall population increase, but that's where the increase is happening and where we have to look at it. And a whole discussion that has been going on a lot lately because of climate change is that some people in developed countries are saying, oh no, all this devastation in nature has been caused more by these developing countries that have been increasing a lot population size. But as we're going to see throughout this semester, the countries that have the highest levels of CO2 emission are exactly developed countries, although their population is not expected to increase so much in these next decades. So we should not blame these guys here, because although they still have a high population growth, the level of emissions of CO2 and damage to the environment is much lower than what we have seen before in America and in Europe and in Asia, okay? And this other table also, I made it based on his talk. It's the same population size, increasing from 7, and then in between here, 8 in 2024, to 9 in 2050, and 11 in 2100, but now broken down by age groups. And his main point is that he has this term that he created called child peak, is that we will reach, because fertility has been declining all over the world, the overall number of children in the world is not going to increase anymore. So it's kind of like stable now. It's going to be stable around 2 billion children, because fertility has been declining. It's still some countries, a lot of like the total fertility rate much higher than 2 children per woman, but overall, on average, the overall number of children in the world is not expected to increase in these next decades. So tending to be around 2. And as these children get older, they go into the next age groups. They go into the next age groups as they keep getting older. So here in the current society, or like more like close to where we are right now, we have these older age groups with 1 billion people, and we expect to increase it, it's not because there is an increase in fertility. It's because these older generations here, they had higher fertility, they produced more children, but now these people here, as they get older, when they produce children, they tend to produce the same amount of children as the previous generations. So each couple produces, on average, 2 children. But these guys here, they produced more, higher number of children than their own generation. That's why younger people is higher here. But these people get older, and then they produce these children, and these ones get older, and these ones produce these children, right? So that's the main idea. I mean, these age groups here, the ranges and the years, they don't match exactly, but that's the overall idea that Hans Rosling is trying to explain to us. It's pretty much now, since total fertility rate is around 2 children per woman, we are just replacing older generations. So this all will tend to be close to 2 billion in each one of these age groups. But also because we have improvements in mortality. People are living longer. By living longer, we will have more people in older ages, from 1 to 2 billion here. And then we're going to have actually an extra 1 billion people reaching at least 75 years of age. So this difference in distribution by age group, it's due to both a fertility decline. So the generations now are just replacing themselves in terms of size. But also we have more people in older ages because we have an improvement in mortality, people living longer, okay? And this process here of higher number of people, or more specifically, a higher percentage of people in older ages, that's what we have been mentioning throughout this course. That's the population aging process, right? That now we're gonna have more people in ages when most of them are not working, and the people in working ages will have to sustain both these older people who are a bigger size now and these children, which are kind of like stable over time. Okay? All clear? Oh yeah, guys, in you from home, I cannot see the chat as usual. So if you have any question, please, I tried to click here, but it doesn't show me.
It's empty right now.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, but some computers, even when I'm in full view, I can see the chat. Sometimes I can't, and I don't know why. So the world population will continue to increase for the rest of our lives, but as Hans Rosling has been indicating or indicated when he was doing his work, is that now the population increase is going to tend to be not so steep as it was in the 70s, for example. Virtually all of it will take place in cities in developing countries, and that's really clear when we look at this table here, by showing how much the African population will increase in between 2013 and 2100, right, by 4 times. And here's just to show another way it showed the population increase. And you see the US increasing the population around 43 to 89 million between 2015 and expected until 2050. But then you see in the African continent and also in Asia, for example, India, really, really high population increase, more than 90 million people in between this period here. So you see that there is a huge Indonesia as well. You see all this increase more concentrated towards developing countries. And here is the percentage of population increase. The population in India is already big in 2015. In absolute terms, they will still increase a lot by 2050. That's why it's so high here. But in this next graph, we are pretty much taking into account the size of the population at the beginning of the period. So we are doing the projected percentage increase in population. So India loses the strength and also the US. And where you're seeing the highest percentage increase is exactly in the African continent and exactly what it was summarized in that previous table that I showed you guys, okay? And this is the demographic distribution of the world's population, just to show that people are not randomly distributed across the world, and they're not randomly distributed within countries. So we see that the east half of the US has a higher number of population than the west half of the US. In Brazil, a lot of the population is really concentrated around the coast. Like here you have Rio, you have São Paulo, and no, sorry, the opposite. You have São Paulo and you have Rio, and you have also some cities in the northeast of Brazil concentrating most of the population. But you also see the same thing in India, in China, the population closer to the East Coast, closer to Shanghai. And also, but in Europe is more related to the population size of each one of the countries, but even within those countries, we have a lot of not random distribution of the population throughout their territory, right? The same in this, you see that really clear in Russia as well. Australia, so you can zoom into each one of these countries and you're gonna see that the population is not randomly distributed. So even in that table, when I was talking about Africa increasing to 4 billion people by 2100, it's gonna still be concentrated in specific cities, in specific areas of the country and putting a lot of pressure in those big urban areas. And here is the population back in 2015. The countries that are more populated, 1.4 billion in China, 1.2 billion in India. And what we expect in the next years. So the next years, we expect India to surpass the population in China because fertility decline in China happened faster than in India. And because of economic development, because of the one-child policy. And we expect India to be the country with the biggest population in the world within these next decades, okay? And you see some, in Nigeria, for example, jumping from 7th place with 183 million people to more than 400 million people. So that's a huge increase. And that's exactly linked to the map that I showed before about the increase in population size in African countries. And this is another graph showing pretty much the same kind of information, but now going back to 1950 and then 2020 and 2100. And this data here is from the Pew Research Center. The Pew Research Center, they collect their own surveys, but they also get data from other sources. In this case, they got data from the United Nations. And they just organize in really friendly graphs and summarize the analysis. I suggest you looking at their website to see both information about overall trends in the world, but they also collect a lot of surveys related to political opinion, to education, to attitudes, to perceptions, about all several different factors in the American society, right? So they collect their own surveys here. But pretty much China passing from the first to the second position in terms of population size, and India becoming the first one. Indonesia increasing and then declining again. And Nigeria also increasing a lot from 2020 to 2100. I mean, not 4 times bigger, but almost that, right? Just within this 80 years here. Cool. So in the next slides in this lecture, They're all extra material, and that's from another textbook by John Weeks. So these extra slides here, you can take a look at them. It's just some more information about specific countries and continents as well. And that material is from this other book, chapters 1 and 2 from John Weeks' textbook, okay? And now we will start in the next chapter about population change in the US. And in this chapter about population change in the US, at the beginning of the chapter, he gives some more historic information about how families were formed and gives you some of this historic background. I will not focus on that. So to be honest, I will not even ask those questions related to those specific topics in the exam. You can read, of course, it's always interesting, but here I will focus more on overall population changes that the US has been experiencing in these last decades. And I will highlight these major demographic topics that the American population has been experiencing. So the US is the country with the highest fertility rate among developed countries. So when I showed you before that previous map of the world and population increase, the US is still contributing a lot in terms of an increase of population in the world because the fertility is still high in the US, and that's usually related to the fact that the immigrants in the US have higher fertility than older generations of immigrants in the US or native-born people in the US. Okay, so immigrants tend to have higher fertility than US natives, but then the children of immigrants and the grandchildren of immigrants afterwards tend to have more similar fertility as US-born people because they are also US-born. The US is now passing through what some demographers call a process in which if we put all minority groups together in the US, they will be more than 50% of the population by around 2044 than the non-Hispanic white population, okay? This term is controversial because in this minority group, we are putting people with completely different experiences in the American society. We are putting together Native Americans, we are putting non-Hispanic Asians, non-Hispanic African Americans, or Hispanic population, multiracial people. We are putting all these people together and calling them minority and saying that they will be the majority of the country, and in the other side, counting only non-Hispanic whites. And because some of the people that self-classify as being multiracial, some of them, one of the races is white. So you're just putting together some people here that are completely different from each other, but at least looking at these trends is interesting to see the changes in race, ethnicity, composition in the country. That's what's interesting from here. But some people might criticize you using this term, majority, minority, okay? So there is a change of origin of undocumented immigrants. Undocumented immigrants in the American history, they used to come from Europe, and then now changing to Latin America, and then more recently too, we have an increase of undocumented immigrants even coming from Asia. They come with tourist visa and they overstay their visa, so they become part of the undocumented population. The US is also experiencing increases in the ages of first marriage. So people devoting more time, more energy to have a better education, get a better job before forming a family. We also have decreases in the percentage of people actually getting married, increases in the levels of cohabitation. And I will talk more about that in depth on the chapter about family and sexuality. So people now tend to cohabit more, so that's more the norm before they get married. And an increasing percentage of births to unwed mothers, to women who are not married, right? So there is this increasing percentage. And in this case here, everything I'm focusing the analysis on the US. So overall, from 1790, which was the first census here in the US, the population increased a lot, an exponential way, so really, really strong throughout this last decade, and reaching more than 300 million people in 2010, okay? And not only population size, we experienced changes in the US, but also in terms of age sex structure, and more specifically in terms of age structure, because you have a decline in fertility. So this age sex structure here for males and females by age groups, we still have a high number of children by 1950. And one interesting thing here about this graph, not all age sex structure graph shows that, but you see that these three bars here, the three first bars, they're in lighter tone than the ones above it, because these ones here are the children, 0 to 4, 5 to 9, 10 to 14. And then you have the working age population from 15 to 64. And then the older people in even darker tone from 65 plus. And another interesting thing that you have here in this graph that sometimes most of the age sex structure graphs, you don't have it, are these dotted lines here. The dotted line indicates the excess male or female population in certain age groups. So even in the US, where there is not a preference for sons, you still have more boys being born than girls. So here, it's how much bigger this bar here is compared to this one. Here you have more boys as well compared to girls. But so we usually have the biological sex ratio at birth around 105 boys for every 100 girls. And that we see exactly in this excess of boys compared to girls. But we also know that women live longer. So after a certain age, we start to see an excess of women compared to men. And in even older ages, that become more pronounced, because this woman here, this is all the more women that you have in this age group from 65 to 69 than men, okay? So that's an interesting way to show all these things together, both the youth population, working age population, and the elderly population, and then the excess of either males or females in each one of the age groups. And because of fertility decline, you start to see by 2017, for example, the overall percentage of children here, it's already smaller than what we see, for example, in the age groups from 20 to 29, right? And what we saw here before was the opposite. These groups here were smaller in percentage terms, and then it starts to be bigger because people live longer, fewer children, you start to change the structure of the population. 2050, that's what is expected, and 2100, a really more a rectangular shape of our age sex structure. And this is the population of the US by nativity. We have the native born population in the US from 2014 to 2060, projected to there, increasing from 276 million to 338. And the foreign born population increased from 42 to 78. And of course, I just mentioned the foreign born population usually have higher fertility than the native born population, but then the children of the foreign born population tends to have similar levels of fertility as the native born. And of course, because the children of foreign born people born in the US are native born, right? And overall, in what we expect for the next decades is that the percentage of the foreign-born population is going to increase, but it's not going to increase so much as some people might say. So it's now around 14%, and it's expected to increase to no more than 19% by 2060. Okay, so this is just getting the percentage. What this number here represents as a percentage of this overall population here. Okay, that's this number here. The mortality in the US, we also have been seeing improvements and people living longer. When you look only at the crude death rate, you don't see much improvement here between 1980 and 2013, exactly because this is just getting the overall number of people dying in the US in each one of these years, divided by the population, multiplied by 1,000, right? We are not breaking it down by age groups. And what we saw is that in more recent years, we have higher percentage of people in older ages. People in older ages are more likely to die than younger people. So overall, the level of mortality is improving, but you don't catch that as much just by looking at the crude death rate. A more in-depth analysis about it, as we're going to see more in detail in the mortality chapter, is that instead of just getting this rate of overall number of people dying divided by the population size, just get that same information, but by age group, right? How many children that were born this year died compared to the number of children that were born? Between 1 to 4, how many children died this year for how many we had in the middle of the period? So just break these rates, these mortality rates by age, we have the age-specific mortality rates. And by using all these age-specific mortality rates, might be difficult for us to understand the level of mortality. So demographers came up with this technique that simplify all these age-specific mortality rates into this indicator called life expectancy at birth. And then we see that the life expectancy at birth has been increasing both for male and female. And what we also see here in this table is that life expectancy at birth is always higher among women than among men. So if we expose a specific group of the hypothetical population into the age-specific mortality rates that were measured in 2013, the male population would live around 76 years. And the female population would live on average 81 years, right? And then we see that we did have substantial improvements in mortality, people living longer. We increased the average number of years among men in 6 years, from 70 to 76, right? 4 years, almost 4 years among women, 77 to 81, 77.4 to 81, okay? Because women are already in a higher level than men, there is less room to improve, and when they improve in a smaller scale, but it's still improving, as did the men, okay? An important discussion also in the US in terms of changes of how our society is organized, it's in the term of how families are organized, or also it's called family economies. Stephen Ruglers, he is a professor at the University of Minnesota, and he's the director of this portal that compiles, that make it available for free for the whole world data from the US and from other countries, census data, survey data, which is called the EPUMS, IPUMS. So if you just check ipums.org, and I will show this website later on in the semester. He is the coordinator of that website, and in this graph here, in this paper, he's showing the family economies of US couples between 18 and 64 years of age, from 1800 to 2010. And back in the 1800s, a really high percentage of families in the US were organized in a way that they call a corporate family. So people working more in agriculture. So they were producing something, selling, and then buying other goods from other people. But it's pretty much a family working in together and usually in more agricultural activities. And then by the second half of the 1800s, and then in the 1900s, you start to have the population move into urban areas, and it's still a society in which men have more opportunities to work outside of the household than women. So you start to have a higher percentage of families in which men work outside of the household and women take on activities within the household. So you have a higher percentage of these male breadwinner households. And in more recent years, when you start to see an increase in the number of women finishing school and entering the labor market, and female labor force participation increases in the country, both the woman and the man, they work outside the household. So we start to see an increase in the percentage of households that both the woman and the man are working outside and bringing money to the household. So, and this is starting more recently in the 1970s. And also even more recently, you start to see some households in which only the woman brings money to the household, both in cases in which you do have the couple, but also in cases that you just have the mother living in the household. But overall, you see changes also in how at the household level, we are organized in other ways. And that's really clear from this transition from a corporate family passing through male breadwinner and now dual earners, right? And in the dual earner society, we tend to have more opportunities for women. So you tend to have more gender equality, but still a lot of disparities between men and women. A lot can still improve, but you start to have more opportunities for women as well. Cool. So let's now go to those 7 topics that I listed at the beginning of the chapter. The US has the highest fertility rate among developed countries. And here in this graph, comparing the number of children per woman, so total fertility rate, comparing the US with France, Sweden, Germany, Italy, and Czech Republic. Germany specifically, getting data only from starting 1989, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, so getting Germany, both East and Western Germany together in this graph. You see a lot of variation in Sweden. It increased at the end of the 80s, and then it started to decline again, and then increase more recently. And there are some studies talking about the specific case of this variation in Sweden, that fertility varies a lot related to economy, right? In moments that you have economic growth, economic development in the country, people tend to form families and have more children, so fertility increases. And then when you start to see some economic recession, fertility declines, right? But so each country has its own story. The Czech Republic, after the end of their rule by Soviet Union, they start to face some economic issues. The families start to face limitations on economic opportunities. And again, exactly early 90s, when that happened, their fertility starts to decline. And then there's a lot of studies in Europe, as I mentioned before, about these fertilities at really, really low levels. And the question is, if you keep having this fertility at really low levels, then you're gonna have a really high percentage of people in older ages and that will put a lot of pressure into the society. But what some of these Eastern European countries are experiencing, and even in Italy as well, a more Western European country, is after they reach these really low levels, fertility starts to increase again. And that's related to what demographers call a postponement in fertility. It's pretty much a generation of women. They try to invest more in their education and jobs. They delay having children, but after their life is more stable, they start to have children at older ages. They postpone their fertility. And then their daughters were doing the same thing. Until you catch up in a specific time, that fertility comes back to around 2 children per woman. But of course, Czech Republic, Italy, and Germany in really low levels, shown here on this graph back to 2006. But what I'm trying to emphasize here overall in the graph is the US, it's a developed country, and it has a fertility, even like in 2006, above the replacement level, above or almost like at around 2.1 children per woman, and in higher levels than these other developed countries, okay? And then it comes that more controversial topic about majority-minority society that the US will achieve around 2044. And this year varies from different demographers, from different projections. Around 2044, the US should be a majority-minority society. Less than half of the country will be non-Hispanic white. So if you put all minority groups together in one side and compare to the non-Hispanic white, one non-Hispanic white will be less than 50%. But again, this is a really simplistic way of analyzing race ethnicity distribution in the US, because among these minority groups that we are putting all together, their experiences are really different. Asians, African Americans, Hispanics, Native Americans, multiracial people, they have completely different, they have different experiences compared to each other. And even within those groups, just now, I had a paper accepted for publication with another professor from our department, and we are focusing on Nigerian Americans. People who were born in the US, but their parents, either the mother or the father, were born in Nigeria. So these Nigerian Americans born in the US, but parents born in Nigeria, if you compare them to other groups, other African American groups, or even to Asians, or even to whites, they have really good levels of education, and they have really good levels of earnings. They have even higher levels of education than non-Hispanic whites. They have similar levels of education as non-Hispanic Asians. And they have similar levels of earnings as non-Hispanic whites. So within this subgroup of African Americans, this group of Nigerian Americans, people that their parents were born in Nigeria, so these are more recent immigrants, they have really high levels of education and earnings. And that's because there is some selectivity in this migration. These people who are migrating more recent years from Nigeria, they already have high levels of education. They already have high levels of earnings. And that passes into their children who are born in the US, right? So what I'm just trying to explain here is that you hear this term, majority-minority society, but within this group of minority people that we are putting them all together and counting them all together, there is a lot of variation, a lot of heterogeneity among these people in terms of education, in terms of earnings, in terms of marital status, in terms of overall socioeconomic status, okay? But what we see here, the percentage distribution of the US population by race and Hispanic origin, in 2014 and 2016. The upper bar being 2014, the lower bar 2016. So if we put together all these minority groups here, in 2014, they were around 38% of the population. And by 26, they will be more than 56% of the population. And white population declining from 62 to 43. The black population almost around the same level, 12, 13%. Alaskan, Indian, and American natives around 0.7, 0.6%, doesn't change as much. Asians also increased over time. And non-Hispanic Pacific Islanders, around 0.2, two or more races, 2 and 4.9%, and Hispanics also increasing. So what you see a lot here is a decline in the non-Hispanic white population, an increase in the non-Hispanic Asian population, and an increase in the Hispanic population. So Hispanic, Asians increasing, whites decline, okay? And the other groups kind of stable over time, but you could say also like 2 or more races also increasing proportionally a lot. But again, we are just putting all these groups here all together and calling them minority. And then are saying that there will be more than 50% of the population, right? And this non-Hispanic white will be less than 50%. Another thing is that this changes in race ethnicity distribution in the country happens in different ways across the states in the US. The states that are now majority minority, California, Hawaii, New Mexico, Texas, Nevada, and also DC. And 8 other states are now between 40 and 49% minority. So almost there, almost reaching 50%. And they will probably become majority minority by exactly by now, the book from 2017. And these other states, the ones listed here, Arizona, Florida, Georgia, and so on, okay? And this is just to show the states that have the lowest percentage of non-Hispanic white population. And demographers, whenever you're talking about whites, blacks, and Asians, just remember this figure here, this graph here. We are talking about non-Hispanic white, non-Hispanic blacks, non-Hispanic Native Americans, non-Hispanic Asians, right? This Hispanic group here, it's already really heterogeneous because that can be a Hispanic white, that can be Hispanic black, that can be Hispanic Asian, and so on. Usually, in the US, we ask the question about race ethnicity separated. We ask race, and then you have these options here. And in some cases, you have the option to choose more than one. And you have the question about ethnicity. In my case, I answer that I am white, and then in the next one, I call myself Hispanic. So I'm in this group here. So the Hispanic group is already putting together a bunch of people with different characteristics, okay? And then when you get this group here and putting them together, even more differences within this group. But what I came back here to say is exactly whenever you're talking about whites, blacks, and Asians, we are usually referring to non-Hispanic, okay? So here in this table is the non-Hispanic white percentage. In 2016, we see the lowest percentages in Hawaii, DC, California, New Mexico, Texas, and Nevada, and other countries that are almost below 50%. Sorry, other states that are almost below 50%. And you can also see variation within states. So in the specific case of Texas, the non-Hispanic white population dropped below 50%, back in 2004. So Texas is already a majority minority state. And what is discussed in the textbook is that the destiny of Texas in terms of demography is with the Hispanic population. The Hispanic population is increasing a lot in these last decades. And the Hispanic population by itself, only the Hispanic group will be more than 50% of the Texas population between now and 2030. Right? So the Hispanic population, I just mentioned, it's really heterogeneous as well. There's a lot of variation between Hispanics, because they can be Hispanic and they don't report any race, or they can be Hispanic white, or they can be Hispanic Asian, they can be Hispanic black, and so on. But putting all these people together, there will be more than 50% of the Texas population within these next 9 years, okay? And this is the projected population by race ethnicity in Texas. And here just showing the non-Hispanic white, non-Hispanic black, and the Hispanic population, and all other groups together in red. And you see the decline in the non-Hispanic white population from 53% in 2000, expected to be around 24% in 2040. The African-American population declined a little bit from 11.6 to 8%. And what's increasing is exactly the Hispanic population. They were almost around a third in 2000 and going up to almost 60%, projected to be almost 60% by 2040. Okay? So that changes all the race ethnicity composition of the state. And that data is for the state as a whole. And if you look at specific counties, here you have the Texas counties with 50% or more of Anglo population. I don't understand why these people here in the US is all these issues with colors, but the blue here are areas with 50% or more of the non-Hispanic white population. And then you see in 2000, all these counties here have at least 50% of the population, and the areas closer to the border tended to have less than 50% of non-Hispanic white population. And then looking at different scenarios of projections to 2040, you start to see that a lot of the counties now more farther away from the southern border start to be also have more than 50% of non-white population, or less than 50% of white population. That's exactly all these white areas here, okay? So the changes, the country, the US as a whole, is increasing the number of non-Hispanic white population, in Texas as a whole as well. And among that non-Hispanic white population, the one that's increasing more is the Hispanic population, as we saw in this graph. And within the state, you already had some areas with a really high percentage of non-Hispanic white populations in the southern borders back in 2000. And that's gonna spread out throughout the state in these next decades as well. Cool? So just to show how demography is interesting, to see the big picture for the country, and then going to the state, and then within the state. And in terms of changes of origin of undocumented immigrants, until now, Mexico has supplied the United States with immigrant workers to take low income jobs. But we have been seeing in more recent decades, or more recent years, not recent decades, in more recent years, a decline in the overall number of Mexicans moving to the US. So right now, the net migration between Mexico and the US, people coming from Mexico to the US and going from the US to Mexico is pretty much equal. It's the same. So the net migration between the two countries is zero because you had a huge decline in immigration from Mexico to the US. And it's still an open debate. Some demographers mention that's because Mexico is passing through economic development, so there are more job opportunities. Other people mentioned that because of the 2008 economic crisis, that declined opportunities for Mexican immigrants to work in the US, and then they stayed in Mexico. The same thing might happen now related to the current pandemic, exactly because the American labor market was hit so bad by the pandemic that might attract less immigrants even further. And another thing in Mexico as well, the same thing that I showed in a graph about Brazil before, is that fertility in Mexico is declining. And people are getting older and better educated. So now in Mexico, you also are passing through this demographic dividend process. The lowest levels of children and older people in relation to working age population. So the dependency ratios in Mexico are declining a lot, right? Because you don't have as many children and as many older people. And that creates a more dynamic society. And these people also had improvements in education, and they tend to have better job opportunities in Mexico as well. That could increase competition for jobs, but at the same time, this crisis that the US experienced back in 2008, that's experiencing now again, that's changing all the dynamic of migration. But you might say, oh, we still see a lot of undocumented immigrants coming from the southern border. As we're gonna see throughout this course, that's not true. That's not based on data. Undocumented immigrants are not coming from the southern border. Most of them they enter the country through the airports and they overstay their visas, their tourist visas. So that's a major thing. That's a major criticism against increasing border security in the south border. That most of the undocumented immigrants nowadays, they're overstaying their visas. They come in airplanes. And what we do see is an increase in immigration from Central American countries to the US. That we have seen started like around 2004. You have an increase in immigration from Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. And you might have heard stories of immigrants from those countries coming like as children without their parents. And that's a concern, like children entering the US without their parents from these countries that experience really high levels of poverty and violence. But what's emphasized in the textbook as well, and here I just got this information from this op-ed that Dudley Poston, the same author of the textbook, and his colleague wrote, is that because now you have this huge decline in the Mexican immigration to the US, Chinese workers, that's a hypothesis that they have. Chinese workers could replace Mexican immigrants in these low-paying jobs. The new influx of immigrant workers who will be fleeing hopeless conditions in China, many of them will enter the US undocumented. How do they enter undocumented? Just as I mentioned before, they enter as a tourist with a tourist visa or something, and they overstay their visa. And a lot of them will take these low-paying jobs because they would have better conditions than they would have if they stayed back in China. But that's a hypothesis that Poston has been emphasized a lot, that a lot of these low-skilled workers from China coming to the US, they could replace Mexican immigrants because now we don't have such a big number of Mexican immigrants coming to the US. And this is the foreign-born population whose residence 1 year ago was abroad and showing the results from Mexico, India, and China. So these are not the overall number of people born in Mexico that are in the US in specific years. The question here is about more recent immigrants. There is a question in the American Community Survey, the ACS, that asks in each one of these years, in which state or in which country did you live exactly 1 year ago? And these are the numbers for people who's reported living 1 year ago, back in 2000, 2001, 2002, and these numbers have been declining, right? And then you will see this decline in Mexico and an increase from India and China. And then China overall, data from 2013, you had 150,000 people reporting that in the previous year, they were living in China, and around 125,000 saying that they used to live in Mexico 1 year before. So again, these are not all Mexicans, all Chinese, all Indians living in the US in each one of these years. That's more related about recent immigration. In each one of these years, people that reported that in the previous year, they were living in Mexico, China, and India. So that shows us trends of migration to the next years. Increasing ages at first marriage. So here's pretty much the median age at first marriage. It was one thing that you see for both men and women. It was higher in 1890, and then it declined in the 50s. And then it started to increase around the 60s and 70s for both men and women. So first you have the trend over time. You have people getting married at younger ages in the 50s and beginning of the 60s. And then you start to have a society in which people start to focus more on education, on jobs before forming a family, and then people get married older. That's the trend over time. Another thing, differences by sex. Men get married older than women, usually because men on average get married with younger women. Another thing also related to sex differences. The differences between age at first marriage between men and women were much wider than now. Now we still see men getting married at older ages than women on average, but these differentials here are smaller than it were in the past, right? So these three different patterns are shown in this simple graph here. And what exactly is median age? Median, we ask all men the age in which they first got married, and we calculate that age in which separates 50% of the people got married older than this and 50% younger than this. So this 26 here means that 50% of the men back in 1890 got married older than 26 and 50% younger than 26. So that's not the average, that's not the mean, it's the median. The median is that number that separates 50% of the people above the median and 50% below the median. But you see that really clear case of more recent years, increasing age at first marriage, still differentials by sex, but not as high as they were in the past. Decreasing percentage of persons marrying. And in this case here, just focusing on women with at least 15 years of age from 1950 to 2014. And you saw this also in the previous graph, that here you get data only more from censuses every 10 years, and then in more recent years, the Census Bureau has data for every single year, right? And that also for decreasing, for information about persons getting married, marital status. So this is only women with at least 15 years of age, data from censuses, and then from surveys. Percentage of women getting married declining, percentage of women who were never married increasing, percentage of women divorced increase and more stable in more recent years, and percent of those widower increase a little bit and then decline. The widower probably because men are now on average living longer, so they don't die. So you have a lower percentage of women in which their partners die. So all these things are connected: mortality, marital status, and so on. And this is another graph outside of the textbook that I just show the trends of marriage and divorce from before 1870 until 2010. So these are not percentages, but we multiplied here by 1,000 people in this graph. And what you see when you just look at the blue line is that the trends in marriage in these 144 years in the US, it's really related to major economic changes that the US experienced. Right? So when World War I ends, you start to have some prosperity in the country, people tend to get married more because they can afford to have a family. When you experience the Great Depression, 1930, everybody lose jobs, a high percent of the population lose jobs, and then you face all these difficulties, marriage rates decline. And you have an increase in marriage up to when World War II ends. And then afterwards, you start to see declining changes, and then you have some prosperity in the 60s and 70s, it increased, and then in more recent years, it declines. And some people, when they're discussing divorce rates, they mention, oh, our society is losing its values, the importance of family as a whole. So that's why divorce rates have been increasing so much. But the thing is even a little bit before that, is that actually the divorce rates, if you see, they follow a lot the same trends as the marriage rates. The same trends that you have here: increase, decline, increase, decline. Same thing that you observed here: increase, decline, increase, decline. So why the divorce rates start to decline now? Because we went back into this more, the society, we have more traditional values, we're gonna marry and stay married and not divorce. It's not because of that. It's because you have overall fewer people getting married. Fewer people getting married, you have fewer people getting divorced, right? So these two rates are important to be analyzed together. Increasing levels of cohabitation. So again, only data for women between the ages of 19 and 44. And this is, they are asked if they cohabitated prior to their first marriage. Data from 1965 to 2009. And now women cohabiting with their partner before formally getting married, the percentage has been increasing a lot in these last decades, from 11 to 68 to 66%, right? So that's changes in values of the society. And that we're gonna talk more, like I mentioned before, in the chapter about family and sexuality, that now cohabitation is the norm. People tend to cohabit before, they might even cohabit during college, they might cohabit after college, but there is a normal situation in which people cohabit before formally getting married. And this graph simplifies that information. And the seventh topic, increasing percentages of births to unwed mothers. And this data here is showing by race and Hispanic origin. From 1959, we just have the total values, but starting in 1980, we have information for non-Hispanic white in green, in dark green, non-Hispanic black in blue, and Hispanic in light green. So this is pretty much the percentage of women who had babies and they are not married. So percentage of births to unmarried women. Overall, it increased from 5.3% back in 1959 to 40% in 2013. But what's important in this graph here is the differential by race ethnicity. The African American population, and this is only data for women, the percentage of those who have children and they are not married, it's really high compared to non-Hispanic white. And the Hispanic woman somewhere in between the two of them. But one thing that we're going to discuss again throughout the course is that this woman here, this African American woman, have high percentages of them having babies and they are not married. Not necessarily they are alone in their household with their children. A lot of them have the partner at home, but they are still cohabiting, right? So that's a different pattern. It's related to socioeconomic status, exactly because this group of the population have lower opportunities for jobs, for education. They postpone marriage, but they have children. And then you see this high percentage here that we see in this graph. And the non-Hispanic white population, more like wealthier overall, they tend to have better education, they tend to have better jobs, they tend to marry before they have children. And that's what's shown here in this lowest percentage compared to the Hispanic woman and African American woman. So all these socioeconomic differentials, opportunities, education, jobs are related to demographic variables. In this case here, marital status. In this case here, having children before being married, right? Before getting married. And this graph, how old are the unmarried women who had babies? So that's the percentage of all births to unmarried women by age of the mother. So here we are breaking by age. So overall, and this is data from 2013. So you see here, 2013, overall in the country, how many women had babies and were not married? 40.6%. 2013, the overall number of women who had babies, they were not married, 40.6. This number is exactly the same as this, 40.6. So only 2013. And then we break it down by age group of this woman who have babies and are not married. And what we see is that among those women who are under 15 years of age, more than 99% of those who have babies are not married. Among women between 15 and 19, 88.7% of them have babies and are not married. And of course, as they get older, they have higher chances of being married, but that shows to policymakers a specific subgroup of the population in which we should be concerned, because these are really young women who are having children, are not married, so they don't have a stable household, and probably they dropped out from school. They probably will get worse jobs in the future as they get older. So drop out from school, get worse jobs, and they have a family to sustain. And the same thing here, as policymakers, we have to look where we see major issues that we have to implement policies to provide opportunities for these people. And that's the cool thing about demography, is that we have to look at this overall data, but think how specifically we can implement policies to create a more equal society in which people have more equal opportunities overall. Okay? So here I finished chapter 13. So everything from chapter 13 will enter the exam. The beginning of the chapter 13, where there's a little history about American families that I will not cover. It's more what I focus here on the slide. And be careful with the time that you spend on each one of the questions in the exam. So you have 40 questions, 1 hour and 15 minutes, which is the same length that we have here in the classroom. We will not have our class here on Zoom on Thursday. The exam will be open from 1 p.m. to 8 p.m. The quiz is now open. Quiz number 5 is now open on Canvas. And one question is going to be about the previous chapter, world population changes over time, and one question about this chapter, US population changes over time. Okay? Thank you very much. Study, and I see you next Tuesday, and you guys take the exam on Thursday. Thank you very much.